Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chief Justice,
January
Senator
1973.
Mrs. Eisenhower,
US President Richard M. Nixon
and my
was
fellow
officially
citizens of
declared the
this
winner
great and
of the
good
1972
country
presidential
we share together.
election. Carly Simon was on top of the US pops with You're So Vain. And on January 19, 1973, Judas Priest signed its first management deal with David Cork. They spent the remainder of 1973 tirelessly honing their craft and honing their live performances. During this time, Priest had established a tight bond with the Cardiff-based band Budgie, a band that Metallica would cover years later on its Garage Days EP. KK recalls his relationship with Budgie.
They were my big favorite band. I was a real big fan. Great band. We used to do 30-odd date tours with those boys. And even when we weren't on tour with them, I can remember one night, because we used to live together, me and Ian, the bass player, this other school friend we had who used to get some gigs, and two girls living in a one-bedroom flat. So there were 5 of us. That's where I perfected the art of silent sex. Or did I ever perfect it?
It was through Budgie that Dave Cork had established a connection with Gull Records and managed to get label owner David Howes along to one of Priest's blistering live performances. Howes, struck by the crowd's reaction to the band, saw potential in Judas Priest and promptly signed them to Gull Records, giving them not only the platform they needed to reach a wider audience, but also the resources to produce their debut album. As summer was giving way to fall in 1974, a new sound was about to make its mark on the heavy metal scene. On September 6th, an album hit the shelves that, unbeknownst to many, would lay the groundwork for a revolution in rock music. The album, Rocka, Rolla, the debut studio album by Judas Priest. Priest had been steadily crafting their unique sound over the latter few years. Rocka Rolla was a statement of intent, a bold entrance onto a stage that was ripe for their brand of heavy and progressive rock. Gritty and experimental, Rocka Rolla was a daring leap into the world of heavy metal, but critics and listeners alike found it challenging to categorize. The album's bluesy elements were a departure from the expected norms of heavy metal, leaving many confused. Others saw it for what it was, a daring experiment, a band searching for and defining its sound, and more importantly, a small sign of things to come. The band struggled with studio issues, which resulted in poor sound quality and a constant background hiss throughout the original pressing. Without surprise, Rocka Rolla hit the shelves with a disheartening thud, selling a mere few thousand copies. The lackluster response to their debut album left Judas Priest in an economically dire situation. The band members spoke of the severe financial struggles they faced during this time, recalling nights filled with hunger and uncertainty about where or when their next meal would come. In an attempt to alleviate their financial distress, the band sought to negotiate a weekly stipend of £50 from Gull Records. However, Gull too was caught in the throes of economic hardship and was unable to meet the band's request. The refusal left Judas Priest grappling with their circumstances, their dreams of rock stardom seemingly fading in the face of these daunting realities. On the back of the commercial failure of Rocka Rolla, and with their dreams hanging by a thread, the band figured they had only one shot left. And so they did what they had to do. They evolved. They made 2 major changes. 1, they decided not to work with producer Roger Bain again, and 2, John Hinch departed, with Alan Moore returning to take his place behind the kit. Notably, a very young engineer, well known today amongst metal circles, got his big break on the project, Chris Tsangarides. Tsangarides subsequently went on to produce albums from the likes of Gary Moore, Thin Lizzy, Halloween, Anvil, Angra, Anthem, Yngwie Malmsteen, and Tigers of Pantang, but he got his big break with Judas Priest's sophomore album.
Chris apparently heard me doing the solo on Victim of Changes and loved it so much that he pleaded to work on the record.
The band's financial struggles continued though. KK remembers.
We were broke, simple as that. While we were recording the album, the money dried up. We've gone Rockfield to Morgan Studios in London, but our tab ran out. We couldn't even afford food and drink. That's how bad things had become. Here we were in one of the most famous studios around with the likes of Black Sabbath and UFO also recording. Living on the breadline.
Rob Halford recalls this time too.
It was a lot of effort and it really took its toll on us. But then none of our albums have been that easy to make. They've all been about blood, sweat, and tears. But that's the way it should be for any band. Give anything less and you get a poor end result.
In all, Judas Priest spent 4 months working on their next album, right through until July 1975. They took the occasional break, but for the most part sank everything they had into making the album as good as it could be. The result? Their 1976 album, Sad Wings of Destiny. It was a game changer. The album showcased a matured sound, lyrics that veered darker, and the innovative dual guitar work of KK Downing and Glenn Tipton. It was an album that set a new standard for heavy metal and featured classics that still find their way into Priest's setlist today, such as Ripper and the inimitable Victim of Changes. The public response to this album was much more favourable and gave the band their first ever UK chart success, peaking at a modest number 48 on the album chart. While the album didn't chart in the US, it has since gone on to sell over 500,000 copies in America and has been certified gold. Still, at the time, this didn't change the band's financial circumstances all that much. Rob Halford remembers.
One day we went to the Gull office and said, look, we want to be a great heavy metal band and show the world that this can be done. It would really help if we could get like 25 quid each per week so that we can put our heart and soul into writing. What if we'd made from touring at the time went to pay off the bills? They refused, so we left.
Gull flat out refused. Priest subsequently broke their contract with them, which led to legal disputes down the track. Having proven themselves, CBS Records, one of the most prominent labels in the music industry at the time, and today known as Sony Records, stepped in and signed Priest in 1977, triggering a period of unbridled creativity and economic freedom. The band released 3 landmark albums in an 18-month stretch: Sin After Sin, Stained Class, and Killing Machine. All 3 albums hit the UK Top 40 chart and featured now classics such as the crowd favourite Diamonds and Rust, where Halford's vocal prowess is on full display. The album also featured Dissident Aggressor, Hellbent for Leather, and Delivering the Goods, which would go on to be covered by bands such as Skid Row and most recently Megadeth. With each album, the Priest pushed the boundaries of what heavy metal could be, experimenting with different sounds and themes. Having first toured Europe in 1974 with Budgie, Priest embarked on its first US tour and played some shows supporting the mighty Led Zeppelin. Priest was ascending and the metal machine seemed like it was unstoppable. Meanwhile, in the heart of London's East End, Steve Harris had endured numerous lineup changes and ended up scrapping the entire band. Even Dave Murray, who went off to record an album with Urchin, which featured eventual Maiden guitarist Adrian Smith. Of this time, Dave Murray had this to say.
6 months after I'd been sacked from the band, I was with Adrian and Urchin. We were playing at one Saturday night at a pub venue in North London called the Breckenridge, when who should be there but Steve. And I was really pleased to see him. I mean, we'd never had any problems. It was only really Dennis Wilcock that sort of objected to me. And we were talking after the gig, and Steve told me that everyone had gone and he wanted to put the band back together with me and a couple of new guys. And so he asked me if I wanted to rejoin the band, and I just said yes, straight away.
Murray and Adrian Smith had been friends since childhood, but that didn't make the decision difficult for Murray. Dave just felt so strongly about Steve Harris and what he was building with Maiden that it was a no-brainer. Harris recruited Doug Sampson to the kit, and while the band endured numerous lineup changes thereafter, things started to slowly fall into place. In November of 1978, having parted ways with vocalist Paul Day, Maiden finally found the singer they had been looking for. Short punk rock hair, tattoos, leather, and attitude. Paul Di'Anno joined the band. The eldest of 10 children from his mum's 2 marriages, Paul Di'Anno was every bit the geezer and wild boy, and his raw and gritty style perfectly complemented Maiden's early aggressive sound. The band began gigging as a 4-piece, despite Harris's desires for a dual and maybe even, at some point, a triple guitar attack. And crowds started to get bigger and more enthusiastic, even though they were mostly constrained to the East End, at venues like the Bridge House. The band was known not only for their raw, vigorous sound, but also for their dramatic, homemade stage show. Steve Harris and his bandmates were always determined to deliver the most electrifying performances possible, even when resources were limited. They believed that a show wasn't just about the music, but the overall experience, and that if they were performing at the Cart and Horses, they should still treat it as if it was the Hammersmith Odeon. And this meant, quite literally, setting things on fire. With an unquenchable DIY spirit, they crafted their own pyrotechnics and lighting effects. They rigged up basic flash pots and strobe lights, creating an atmosphere that was both chaotic and captivating, at least compared to everything else on the pub scene at the time. This was mostly thanks to a friend of the band who didn't mind messing around with gunpowder, Dave Lights.
I did actually blow Steve up once. On stage he was wearing these PVC trousers and I ended up setting fire to them. Well, this particular night, it was a special occasion, one of the first big gigs outside the East End, and so I decided to pile it on bigger than usual. We thought, well, it's a bigger gig than usual, so we'll make a bigger gig than usual, so we'll make a bigger bang than usual. But of course, when it went off, everything just exploded. And it was right where Steve was standing, and I remember his PVC trousers caught fire. Well, they just sort of melted, actually. He had to peel them off bit by bit, along with all the hairs on his legs.
The band started to believe their own hype too, taking out ads in magazines like Melody Maker that read, "We break, shake, shock and rock. We make the rest look average stock." The ads were meant to wind up other bands, and wind them up they did. After a brief 6-month hiatus, Harris took out an ad that read simply, "Iron Maiden are not only the best visual, high-energy, original, loud but talented, good-looking, tasteful, heartbreaking, hard-hitting, blood-sucking, mind-blowing hard rock band in London, we're also very nice blokes, kind to our fans and our families, hostile to other bands, but above all, we're brilliant, ace superstars, and we're honest, and we're back. So fans, record companies, A&R men, agents, promoters, financiers, and able young ladies, watch this space for details." Shortly after this ad went live, a Maiden gig was unexpectedly disrupted by members of rival East End bands, who proceeded to douse Maiden's monitors with beer. According to Steve Harris, a massive Barney ensued, but the band members were unfazed. They knew how to take care of themselves, and were no strangers to a brawl in those days. Steve recalls with a cheeky grin,
"It never happened again, put it that way."
but while Maiden had ambitions to conquer the world, they had a hard time getting out of East London, as most venues in town proper, in a time of the Sex Pistols, the Clash and the Cockney Rejects, wanted nothing to do with long-haired heavy metal bands. Punk rock was the order of the day. If Maiden wanted to be bigger than Leighton, they needed to record a demo and ship it around town. It was their only way to maybe get some gigs in bigger and better venues across the city. Despite having little money, in the winter of '78, they scraped together their pennies to record a demo at a proper studio. They recorded on New Year's Eve, and because everybody else was out partying, they managed to haggle and hired the studio and an engineer for little more than £200. The result was a 4-track cassette that featured the classics Iron Maiden, Invasion, Prowler, and Strange World, all of which would end up on Maiden's self-titled debut album. The demo was a raw and energetic reflection of their potent live performances, but it was a subsequent decision that truly catalyzed their rise. While punk was dominating, metalheads had a sanctuary in the Bandwagon Heavy Metal Soundhouse, a back room in the Prince of Wales pub in Kingsbury, North London. It was run by none other than the long-haired and bearded Neil Kay. To this day, the place is considered by many to be the birthplace of the new wave of British heavy metal, a movement that claimed bands like Maiden, Priest, Def Leppard, Motorhead, Saxon, and Diamond Head, amongst many others. Steve Harris handed a copy of the demo tape to Kay, with Kay responding,
"Yeah, you and 5 million others, mate."
2 weeks passed, and Kay eventually did listen to the tape, and he was blown away, running around his living room like a madman listening to it. It quickly hit rotation at the Soundhouse, and before too long, Kay, who ran the Soundhouse magazine and music chart, moved the Prowler to the top of the Soundhouse's chart, outclassing even established bands like Judas Priest and Black Sabbath. It stayed at the top of the chart for months. The band brought its show to the Soundhouse and tore audiences' heads off, proverbially of course, and quickly became the talk of the town. Word of mouth spread like wildfire, and during this time they caught the attention of not only a powerful and influential bloke, but one who would help to take Maiden's career into the stratosphere. Enter Rod Smallwood, Maiden's manager to this very day, almost half a century later. Steve Harris recalls it.
If Rod hadn't have come along when he did, honestly don't know if any of this would have happened. We'd have probably got signed in the end and made a few albums, but somehow I just don't think it would have happened for us in the way it did if it hadn't been for Rod.
After headlining the Marquee in London, with support from Praying Mantis, Maiden signed to EMI, one of the world's and indeed England's biggest record label at the time, a deal brokered by Rod Smallwood. It was actually at this point that Smallwood formally put pen to paper on managing the band. Up until that point, he had agreed to help however he could, but he resisted from signing on the dotted line. However, the band was still a 4-piece at this stage, and Harris was yet to realize his vision for a dual or triple guitar attack. Maiden began to audition guitarists, and invited one Dennis Stratton along to try out. Like Harris, Stratton was an aspiring footballer as a youth, and was also briefly on the books at West Ham United. But when it came to Iron Maiden, he didn't need to try out at all.
We had a drink and a chat, and it was like I'd got the job. They didn't need to hear me play or sing, because Steve had already seen me down the Bridge House and decided. He just wanted to have a natter first. It was, "Can you learn these songs, because we signed to EMI and we're gonna be doing an album?" I was like, yes, no problem. I was pleased as punch. You know, because you could tell just by the gear they had and the setup that they were taking it seriously, and there was a bit of a vibe to them. So that was it. I was in.
While Priest was racing ahead, having released 4 albums and toured Europe and the United States, Maiden was quickly emerging as a contender, and they were about to enter the studio to record an album of their own. In the next episode of Battle of the Bands, both Iron Maiden and Judas Priest released their landmark albums, and Maiden would begin to challenge Priest for a seat on the British heavy metal throne.